In this lecture video, we're going to be talking about the ethics of experimentation. And a little bit along the way, kind of getting to that point, what made us come up with the ethical rules that we now have? Particularly, what are some unethical studies that happened in the past that led to things like the Nuremberg Code and the Institutional Review Board being institutions that oversee the ethics of human experimentation. So ethics and psychological science. I just wanted to get a little bit into, and especially with the psychological aspects of some unethical research that did go on in the past, and especially the really important studies that ended up shaping the way we now talk and think about ethics and psychology. And psychology has not had the best track record when it comes to the ethical treatment of people, at least not all people. And actually the first person we're going to talk about is a really good example of how psychologists, along with many other scientists in the country, were pretty discriminatory in the past. So one good example of this is Robert Yerkes, and you might remember him, you might have learned about him in maybe a history of psychology class or an intelligence class, because he's one of the psychologists to invent and perfect the IQ test. Of course, IQ stands for intelligent quotient. It's a scale with an average of about 100 that gives you an idea of how intelligent someone is. So the government sponsored his work because they wanted a quick and easy test to give to soldiers so that they could take one test and decide, is this soldier someone who would be good on an intelligence mission, or is this someone we should really just, put into sort of more of a grunt role, less of an intelligent role. So he ended up perfecting his IQ tests with lots and lots of different people. Over 1.7 million different soldiers took his IQ test in the first couple of decades of its inception. And one thing he noticed while crunching all these numbers is that people who were immigrants to the U.S., so basically people who weren't natively born in the U.S., tend to have lower IQ points than those who are non-immigrants. Now, this makes total sense when you take into account cultural differences. A lot of immigrants to the U.S., English wasn't their first language, and of course IQ tests were administered in English, and so that's going to be a natural barrier. But also the IQ tests of their time in the 19-teens and 20s often had questions about U.S. history. Or, for example, U.S. government. One of the questions was, what are the three branches of the U.S. government? Legislative, judicial, and executive. So it's one of those things where it's very easy to explain this as just being caused by cultural differences, but Yerkes, and he was of his time, went along with another popular theory, basically that immigrants were genetically inferior to non-immigrants, which is ludicrous just on the face of it because most of the immigrants he was talking about were people from Ireland, Poland, even Germany, in which cases there's really no genetic difference between those groups and people who are maybe second or third generation Americans who originally came from those countries to begin with, or other people from England, other neighboring parts of Europe. And so he was one of the big proponents of establishing limits on to how many people could immigrate to the U.S. and what types of people could immigrate to the U.S. So because of his research, the U.S. placed quotas, especially early on in the 1900s, limiting people from Ireland, Poland, different areas that tended to show lower IQ rates, and then not limiting the quotas from other places like England that didn't show such deficits. So, that's bad enough, but also he was in the profession of saying, okay, if there are these differences, what causes them? Now, since he thought there were roots in genetics, he tried to establish, through lots of different biological measures, the inferiority, quote-unquote, of African Americans, Central and South Americans, Polish, Italians, Irish, Jews, basically anyone who wasn't completely anglicized. He did this through many means, not only just his IQ test, but he also was in the school of phrenology, so he would measure bone density and the shape of the skull and try to say, well, okay, African Americans tend to have dips in their skull here, so that must mean that they're less intelligent in mathematics. And of course, that has absolutely no validity whatsoever. But they basically used lots of different measures to try to infer that these groups were inferior. And of course, if you go in with any preconceived notion, you're often going to find what you're looking for, just because you're using often biased tests or subjective ways of looking at the data. And just, on this type of research, modern research shows that there is no genetic inferiority of these races at all. And in fact, there's way more genetic differences within each race than between races. But this whole movement really became very popular. It's called the eugenics movement, basically trying to either use genetics directly by using selective breeding programs, or maybe indirectly by making it more difficult for certain races to get married or to have children, in order to create better people of tomorrow, genetically stronger people of tomorrow. And this whole movement really took off out of Yerkes' work. He was a big proponent for it. He was one of the people who introduced the Eugenics Record Office, which was founded in New York. And basically, you go to this office with you and your wife or you and your husband, you'd get a blood test. Very often, they would actually just make sure that you're white. And if you were white, they would say, congratulations, you are, let me just read this, you have the perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love, which whatever that means, well fitted to promote the welfare and happiness of the race. So it was one of those things where it was sort of a pass for white people to say that, look, we are going to this institution and this proves, this little slip of paper or record proves that we're genetically superior. And then in 1909, this got even more serious because lots of states started legalizing mandatory and forced sterilization of people who were mentally retarded, mentally ill, basically people who didn't have a lot of rights to begin with. Now they would forcibly castrate them. And in 1928, by this time, hundreds of universities offered courses on eugenics, including courses on who to sterilize, how to make it easier for certain populations to mate and produce offspring and make it harder for other races to do it while still staying within the realm of legality. And some of these were taught at Harvard, Stanford, Yale. Many other universities had very strong eugenics programs. And Robert Yerkes was a traveling lecturer who would talk at many of these universities. Of course, we all know what this culminated into, which is basically World War II. So Germany, and Hitler, namely, took this really to heart and said, okay, if we believe in this eugenics stuff, let's really take it to its logical limit and not just make it harder for some people to mate and easier for some people to procreate. And actually, there were movements in the U.S. that would offer certain tax breaks for certain races to create offspring and not for other races to create offspring, because that was their way of limiting unfavorable genes. The Germans said, let's go one step further and actually try to eliminate the genes of the Jews, the Gypsies, homosexuals, and of course that became the Holocaust. So in the beginnings of the 1930s, when Germany was taking off with this idea, this just little poster shows that they were, one of many nations that supported this. The I can't really read that. I can't read the middle one, but we something nicht allein means we are not alone. So at the top of the list of people behind the eugenics movement is, of course, the United States flag up there. You can see Sweden, Japan, other nations. Now, when the American troops started going overseas during World War II and uncovering these gulags, or well, that would be in Russia, but these ghettos, basically death camps where they're keeping and killing Jews, then suddenly the eugenics movement started to leave a bad taste in people's mouths. But before that, in 1927, Fortune magazine, one of the top-selling magazines of the time, did a big national poll of tens of thousands of people, and 85% of people supported eugenics movements, basically mandatory sterilization of the mentally ill and retarded, limiting mating of what they call unfavorable races, like African Americans, Polish individuals. But then by the time the war ended, the vast majority of U.S. citizens opposed it, because they sort of saw what happened when you really took this movement to its logical limits. And a big thing that came out of that is the Nuremberg War Tribunal. So this is where they put a lot of German doctors on trial, along with SS officers and other German officials who killed Jews. But the Jewish doctors in particular were put on trial because of the experiments they ran on Jews, oftentimes killing Jews by, for example, seeing how cold you could make a room before a person died, literally injecting motor oil into their veins to see what the effect was, doing all these really ridiculous and not very intelligent tests, but just to see the limits of the human body, and of course using Jews as basically guinea pigs. So because of the Nuremberg War Tribunal, we end up getting the Nuremberg Code of Medical and Research Ethics, which we've been following ever since. And this is a code basically that states we should avoid risk and harm to people whenever possible. And very importantly, whenever we experiment on people, people should be informed about any risks beforehand, and that participation should be completely voluntary. And even voluntary to the point where if a participant for any reason decides to quit, even if it's at the very end of the study or in the middle of the study, they have the right to do so and not incur any penalty, and in fact get any rights and privileges offered to them. So because of this, for most research, if you go in and they say, hey, we'll give you $100 to do this, this, and that, if you start the experiment and then say, you know what, I'm uncomfortable, I want to leave, they still have to give you the $100. So you're never penalized for quitting research, even if you haven't finished it yet. But that doesn't mean that this code was always followed. And in fact, the U.S. was one of the worst followers of this code, even though they were the main proponent of it during the Nuremberg trials. One example of this is that people in the U.S. didn't believe that this code of ethics applied to people with mental disabilities. And so one example was the Willowbrook Mental Hospital wanted to do a test to see what were the effects of different types of hepatitis. And they wanted to do a controlled trial, but they knew they couldn't do that ethically on most people, so they picked on the mentally retarded who were kept at the Willowbrook Mental Hospital. And in this case, over 700 children were involved, actively given different strains of hepatitis and followed over years to tell what the effects were. And of course, some of these children even died from this. There are, in some cases, lethal strains of hepatitis if left untreated. In this case, they figured that they were following the Nuremberg trial or the Nuremberg Code rather, because all the parents of these patients agreed to let their children be exposed to this. So why did they let their children be exposed to hepatitis knowingly? Well, for one, they were sort of pressured to. They were often inferred that if you don't allow us to experiment on your child in this way, we're not going to allow them to be at the Willowbrook the Willowbrook Mental Hospital. But also, they were rewarded. So any child who partook in this program received better special treatment. They received more care from nurses and doctors. Also, they received more expensive medical treatments like medications and all that kind of stuff for anything other than hepatitis. And oftentimes the parents weren't really sure what was going on. They just knew that they were being injected with some strain of illness, but often they didn't even know it was hepatitis, what strain it was, or what the effects of that would be. A similar case, and one that is probably even more notorious, is the Tuskegee syphilis studies that took place over the course of 4 decades. And in this case, what happened was they wanted to see what were the effects of syphilis if left untreated, and also to compare that to syphilis that was treated, oftentimes with penicillin-derived medications. So in this case, they set up a free clinic, and it was in several places, including Tuskegee, and they, well, put in quotes here, treated people with syphilis. Now, most people came to the clinic, did get free treatments for syphilis, but of all the African American people who came, they were, unbeknownst to them, put into a study where half of them received just a placebo, basically a saline solution, instead of the actual medication. So in this case, no one was actively given syphilis, but there were people who thought they were being treated who actually weren't being treated. And this included only African American patients. Again, a big show of prejudice there. They didn't do this to any white people coming to the free clinic. But in the course of 4 decades, about 400 African American patients were unknowingly withheld from medication that they thought they were getting. What's even worse and more nefarious is that the doctors knew that this disease was fatal. They knew that many of these patients would end up dying without any type of medical care, but they wanted them as a control group. Even worse, the patients were never actually told that they had syphilis. The doctors who were diagnosing them in this group just use a term that you have bad blood that's making you ill. And so we're going to give you this treatment, which was, of course, actually saline solution. And then the U.S. Public Health Service went one step further and actually told other doctors elsewhere that they could not treat these patients. So in other words, if the patient went to see another doctor, the U.S. Public Health Services would withhold any future treatment of them, and then that doctor would have his license revoked. So if the patient was receiving health care at these free clinics and they said, well, I'm not getting any better, I'm going to go see another doctor, the doctor would have to refuse them, or else the U.S. Public Health would basically revoke their medical license. So these people were basically, many of them, doomed to die in this experiment that they didn't even know they were a part of. So by the time the study ended in the 1970s, about 130 of the original patients had died. Many other had lifelong disorders because of syphilis, which include blindness, many things, damaged memory, many other symptoms of long-term syphilis sufferage. Not only did the patients suffer, but 40 wives of these patients also contracted syphilis from their husbands who thought they were getting treated and didn't even know they had syphilis. They thought they just had bad blood, whatever that meant. And because of this, 19 children were born with syphilis because of the wives who had contracted it. So this actually ended up impacting a lot of people's lives, and these are just the ones we know about. There were some that left the study and they really couldn't follow up on them, and so who knows what the actual death and harm toll of these studies were. Now, in the end, later on, I think this was about in the 90s, this was during somewhere in the Clinton administration, the families won a suit against the study, basically against the U.S. government for funding this study. They only won about $10 million, and so each of these families only received really a few $1,000s. So it wasn't really anywhere near the cost to them in terms of death, medical care, or suffering that they went through. They did receive an official apology from President Clinton, but really, I mean, that was, in some cases, 50 years after the fact, so definitely too little too late. Now getting a little bit more back to psychology, because that was sort of in biomedicine, but we'll talk more about the Tuskegee studies when we talk about ethical boards that sprung out from that. But another really sort of unethical program that was going on in the realm of psychology was the advent of the frontal lobotomy. So this was a technique that was discovered, well, not really discovered, but applied to humans first by Igas Moniz, who was originally a psychologist working with monkeys. So he noticed that these, I shouldn't call them monkeys, they're chimps. Of course, it's part of the great ape family. But they found that certain chimps had just basically bad tempers. They were aggressive. And if they gave them this treatment where they would whisk away, they would send a little object up their frontal nose cavity and into their frontal lobes and whisk away the frontal part of their brain, that the chimps would suddenly lose their bad temper and become very placid and easygoing. So he said, oh, this is great. It works with chimps. Let's see if it applies to humans. And so with humans, they made the technique a little bit different. In fact, Igas Moniz was the guy who invented this new special technique to use on humans. So instead of going through the nasal canal and puncturing the sinuses, they started doing it through the eye canal. So pretty gruesome there. That was one of the less gruesome pictures I could find on this. But this was a procedure that he perfected literally in his kitchen with an ice pick, practicing on oranges. And he said, I think this is something we can do. So he invented this little tool, which was much like a curved ice pick, that he would stick near the tear glands of a person's eyes, so in the inside corner of their eyes, go up into the frontal part of their brain, and just swish it around. It wasn't all that targeted to any specific part of the frontal brain. He just said you just had to kill some of that tissue because apparently that's where aggression lives. Of course, now we know that that's where a lot of other areas of the brain live, like inhibition, personality, problem solving, lots of things, thinking about the future. So many, pretty much all of the higher order brain functions live in the frontal lobes. And in the end, he ended up forwarding a movement that treated, quote unquote, 40,000 people in the U.S. So it became a huge standard of treatment, especially for anyone suffering from any type of mental illness. So if someone had schizophrenia, if someone was overly aggressive, if they were a repeat offending criminal, even if they were mentally disabled, if they were mentally retarded to begin with, they would often perform these frontal lobotomies to, quote unquote, make them less aggressive, more placid, happier, all that kind of stuff. And there are actually a lot of famous cases of this. So, for example, President John F. Kennedy's sister was one of these. She was suffered from mental illness, and she was given frontal lobotomy. Tennessee Williams' sister, many other famous cases. It became especially sort of a Hollywood treatment, a very popular Hollywood treatment to give to anyone's family members who maybe had some type of mental disorder. And of course, what it did most of the time was just cause mild to severe mental retardation. So in many cases, it just made them more placid because they had less volition, they had less awareness and self-awareness. They would basically just do whatever you told them to because they now lacked pretty much all personality or sense of identity. And in some cases, when these procedures were completely blocked, the person would go completely comatose or became basically a vegetable. So it took a long time, quite a few years, for this technique to be seen first as something that was questioned, maybe this isn't great for patients, to finally villainized and the APA coming out and saying, basically, you should never do this treatment for a cure for anything. We actually do have a modern variant of this called I think it's called a cingulate bilateral cingulotomy, I think is how you say it. But it's a very selective portion of the frontal lobes that's taken away, and it's done through actual brain surgery where they take open the skull and they very selectively cut away brain tissue. And it's only for extreme cases of aggression. So in some cases, we still do this sort of thing, but not at all like the technique they used back then. Another case I think is very interesting of ethics in psychology, and this was actually not done by a psychologist but by a market researcher, was this guy James Vickery, who started figuring out ways to put in little subliminal messages in the advertisements that came before movies. So one of his more famous examples is for 3 milliseconds, which is, of course, way shorter than the time you'd be able to consciously recognize something on the screen. He put up the words, "Hungry, eat popcorn." And he said that this, in some cases, tripled concession sales, but he basically made up these incredible claims that they basically couldn't produce enough popcorn if you just showed this little message to people. People would be clamoring to the concessions for popcorn. So this sparked this worldwide fears over subliminal brainwashing. This was during the Cold War era, and the Congress was so spooked about this, they actually put a ban against any subliminal messages in TV, radio, movies, anything like that. Anything where you could flash a stimulus for a very short amount of time. Of course, with radio, it'd be hard to do, but there are arguments that you can very quickly and sort of just subliminally, just below conscious awareness, maybe quieter than normal, implant some type of message. Now, actual research since then has shown that these messages, by and large, don't have much of an effect on behavior at all. Sometimes you can make people feel a little anxious if you flash images of things that are anxiety-provoking. So if someone is spider-phobic and you flash very quickly images of spiders, that might start their heart beating a little bit, even though they're not consciously aware that they're seeing spiders. But this whole thing of, hungry, eat popcorn, that's just ludicrous. That kind of thing doesn't actually change behavior or implant any message in people's brains. And certainly if the Russians took control of the airwaves and put in a little message said, kill the president or whatever, that's not going to have an effect at all. So it's, I wouldn't even say it's very likely. I'd say it's absolutely likely that James Vickery made up his results and published them without, of course, any peer-reviewed, guidance and without any replication that's ever supported his statements. But still, it spooked a lot of people, and it put psychology in a bad light for a long time. That psychologists were people who were trying to mind control individuals and create, mindless armies of tomorrow and all that kind of stuff. And believe it or not, these subliminal messages still pop in once in a while. You often see them in political advertisements. So I just wanted to give you guys a couple of examples of ways in which these messages have been kind of cleverly put into certain ads. So here, this ad is from the political campaign when Gore was running against Bush. And you'll see, well, you might not see the message at first, but then we'll get into exactly what the message is.
Under Clinton-Gore, prescription drug prices have skyrocketed and nothing's been done. George Bush has a plan. Add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare.
Every senior will have access to prescription drug benefits.
And Al Gore? Gore opposed bipartisan reform. He's pushing a big government plan that lets Washington bureaucrats interfere with what your doctors prescribe. The Gore prescription plan? Bureaucrats decide. The Bush prescription plan...
So I don't know if you saw it, but in one very particular part of the commercial, toward the end, you see this frame. So frame 373, it comes up with rats right there. And this is when they're talking about Democrats. And of course, rats is part of the word Democrats. So when Democrats zooms in and out and becomes a word on the screen, at one point it flashes rats. And so what I want you to do now, look at the commercial again and see if you can spot this exact moment. Now that you know what you're looking for, it's toward the end of the ad, you'll probably be able to see that exact moment.
Under Clinton-Gore, prescription drug prices have skyrocketed and nothing's been done. George Bush has a plan. Add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare.
Every senior will have access to prescription drug benefits.
And Al Gore? Gore opposed bipartisan reform. He's pushing a big government plan that lets Washington bureaucrats interfere with what your doctors prescribe. The Gore prescription plan? Bureaucrats decide. The Bush prescription plan...
So hopefully you saw it that time. It's very quick, but this is not technically subliminal because you can consciously see it. But the advertisers were forced to take this off the air once it was discovered, and they later admitted to, in fact, they had meant to do that. That they had thought maybe they could associate, Democrats with something bad like rats. And if you can find an effect from subliminal messaging, that could be one that you could sort of negatively valence something by repeatedly pairing it with negative stimuli like rats or words like cancer, death. Who knows if this would have a real effect on people's attitudes towards something which they already know a lot about, like a political candidate. But studies do show you can change people's attitudes about new things, like a new product, by repeatedly subliminally pairing it with positive or negative images and words. This is another example that happened just a few years later, and this was when McCain was going up against Obama. Here, I'll go ahead and let you see this. This one shows it down within the same clip so you can see exactly what's going on.
Right now, on Fox 5 News at 10.
Back we are now with a Fox 5 News exclusive.
A message of hate found in a pop.
Right now on Fox 5 News at 10.
Back we are now with a Fox 5 News
So you can see in these types of ads, they're trying to basically expose you again and again to the image of John McCain. In this case, this might come from research that shows if, and this is again with stimuli that are pretty neutral, not like a political candidate, but let's say you have a new product, if you just repeatedly expose people to that product over and over and over again, people will start to like it more, because familiarity breeds liking. But this is kind of a dumb idea to do it in this context if they really were trying to accomplish that effect, because this was during the political campaign between McCain and Obama, and at this point people were seeing McCain's face, probably at least once a day, if not more. So just seeing it for that extra millisecond, I'm sure wasn't really going to do anything. But anyway, you can see that the attempt was definitely there. That was definitely something that they knowledgeably sort of slipped in there. So now going on to another psychological study, and again one that really calls into question the ethics of research, is the very famous Stanley Milgram studies. So you probably heard a little bit about this. We're going to show a video on it here in a bit. So this is a study that came out of a reaction to what happened during World War II, where they saw a lot of people, Germans, who were just asked to do things that were quite atrocious and voluntarily did it. So manned death camps, shot and killed Jewish individuals who might have been their neighbors, just a few years earlier. And at the time, the world kind of wondered, is there something different about the German personality and individual that would make them do these things? But Stanley Milgram kind of thought, I bet most people put in the position of a subordinate, someone who has to take orders, would commit some pretty atrocious things. So he said, let's see if we can get Americans to commit something atrocious just because someone in power is telling them to do so. So what they did is they got a bunch of participants, and they did many different versions of this, but we'll get into just the main version they did. They got a bunch of different participants from the community, and they had them come in, each individually, and with them came in an actor posing as another participant. So participants were assigned to either the role of teacher or learner just by drawing one of those two out of the hat. Now the actor would draw out a slip that always said teacher. In fact, all of the slips in the hat said teacher, but just pretend that he got the learner slip. And of course, the participant pulled out the slip and it would always say teacher. So in this case, the participant was always assigned to the role as teacher, and the confederate, the person posing as a participant, would always get the role of a learner. And in this experiment, the teacher was told to read off pairs of words that were just randomly assigned, like apple, airplane, cat, trampoline, but just random word pairs. And then during the testing trial, the teacher would just say one word in the word pair. So he might say, cat, and the person would have to say the corresponding word that went along with it. And each time that the learner got something wrong, they would be electrically shocked. Now, they would start off with very weak voltages, like around 10 volts, but it would go steadily higher and higher, and eventually the dial ended up all the way to 450 volts, which is definitely a lethal dose of electricity that would kill most people. And they started off very small doses, and they told this teacher that every time the learner got a wrong answer to go up one notch in the electrical scale. So during this experiment, the learner starts off just, displaying minor signs of discomfort, kind of yelping a little bit when they're shocked. But then by the time that the learner gets to being shocked with, 100, 120, 150 volts, the learner, who of course is an actor, and the actor is not getting shocked in reality, but they're pretending that they are, starts to complain of pain, heart problems. They eventually, around 200 volts, start to scream. The whole time they're saying, I don't want to be in this study, let me out of here. And of course, they're strapped in, so they can't leave. And eventually, around 300 volts, they actually stop reacting completely. They just go basically dead, and they feign death. Now, in the original run of these experiments, the teacher could only hear the learner over a loudspeaker. This made it easy because they could literally play the exact same audio for every single participant. But they eventually got actors who would do this in front of the teacher physically, and they did the same thing, where the learner would basically feign death at a certain point, like he'd been shocked to death. So if a participant wanted to stop, or ever at some point said, should we stop doing this, the experimenter just told them, please continue. It's essential that you continue. Just statements like this. So they never said, you have to do this, or the law requires you to do this. They would just say, please continue. And so basically they set up a little experiment where the experimenter was in effect asking a participant to kill another person. And so the question was, where would most people stop? Would most people stop once the learner started complaining of pain or asked to leave? Or would they go all the way to 450 volts, all the way to where they had effectively killed someone, or at least thought they'd killed someone? So here's a great little video, and actually this is just sort of a sub-part of a longer video called Obedience that was actually put out by Stanley Milgram. But it's a great video showing the reactions and some of the behavior they got in this study. So you can see in that video that most of the participants really were made very uncomfortable by this study. They didn't obviously want to kill someone. They weren't homicidal individuals. In fact, many of them were just regular caring people. Of course, that didn't stop them from following orders all the way, at least 65% of them, all the way up to going up to 450 volts. So the ethics of this is not whether someone was physically harmed, because obviously there was an actor pretending to be electrocuted, but a study like this could potentially be very psychologically harming to participants, both because they're witnessing someone being in pain in front of their eyes and knowing that they're the one doing it, and also because afterward they have to reflect and go, man, I could have really killed someone in there if that wasn't fake. I'm a person capable of murder. I didn't know that before. So in this case, this is a very interesting study of how far can you go in revealing something that might be really psychologically damaging to participants. And it became a major concern to the researchers. After it was published, people started asking these questions, and so the researchers went back, collected these participants again 1 year later, and gave them psych evaluations. Thankfully, it turned out that none of the participants suffered any long-term psychological damage. And when asked, the vast majority said that they were actually glad that they had partaken in the study because they learned something about themselves, and that they hoped they became better people because of it. So in this case, they kind of looked out that there wasn't any real damage, but if someone had been psychologically vulnerable to begin with, maybe they were depressed or had low self-esteem or had maybe even thoughts of suicide before this, you could see how something like this could tip someone over. It's a dangerous situation. It's a dangerous game to play. Another really interesting version of how far you can ethically take a study in treating participants is, of course, the other famous study, the Stanford Prison Study. So this one was done by Philip Zimbardo over at Stanford University. And in this case, he wanted to see what putting people in certain roles would do to their personality and behavior. He was especially interested in how people, oftentimes just very caring young individuals, would join the army and within a few years be transformed into basically killers, people who would kill upon command. Sort of like how Milgram was interested in how regular people could eventually, maybe because someone who's working at a death camp. So he thought, we'll do this little experiment. We'll turn a basement in the Stanford psychology room or a building into a fake prison. And then we'd take a bunch of undergrads and assign them randomly to either role of guard or prisoner. So in this case, they wanted to see if these social roles would have any effect on their actual behavior, would basically change the way that they would normally function around others. And so he did his best to make prisoners feel very powerless. He actually sent actual cops and cop cars to these participants' homes at a time they weren't expecting, arrested them in public, even in front of their neighbors and everything. Once they got to the prison, they stripped them naked, deloused them just like you would in prison, and then gave them these numbers. As you can see, this one is 5486. And this was just to make them feel like less of an individual. Like they didn't even have a name anymore. They were just a number, someone who could be stripped naked against their will, deloused, put in a cell, and just basically treated without their consent. And the guards, on the other hand, were made very powerful. They were given a weapon, a club. They were told never to use the weapon in an aggressive way against the prisoners. But they were given this weapon as a show of power. They were given uniforms, these reflector sunglasses so that they could look at prisoners, but prisoners could never look them directly in the eye. And of course, they were given complete control over the prisoners. They couldn't harm them in any way physically, but they could taunt them. They could make them do chores. They could make them do physical activities like push-ups. They could yell at them. So they could do any psychological or verbal type of damage they wanted to against these prisoners. And so here's another video. This one's a little bit longer, but it gets into this what became a really crazy experiment, the Stanford Prison Study. And I like this video especially because it interviews Zimbardo himself many years after the fact, as well as some of the prisoners of note years after the fact. And you get to see what they thought about it from the inside during the time.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room for anything else because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we called the hole. And the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. All the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses. And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of the humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards as a category are people who have power over others, in this case, power over the prison.
Like Milgram, Zimbardo was interested in the power of social situations to overwhelm individuals. His experiment would test people's responses to an oppressive regime. Would they accept it or act against it? Prisoners were brought to the basement prison, blindfolded, to confuse them about their whereabouts. They were stripped and deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's the start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
On the second morning, the prisoners had decided to stir things up as well. The guards found some of them had used their beds to barricade their cell. Prisoner 8612 was one of the ringleaders of the rebellion.
Initially, I was stunned. I didn't expect a rebellion because not much happened. I mean, it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against. But they were rebelling against the status, rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students.
As punishment for the rebellion, prisoner 8612 was put in the hole, and the guards turned on the other prisoners.
The guards felt that they now have to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you little punk, you big shit, and so. And the guards got furious.
Well, gentlemen, here it is time for count.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up in a line and have me hurl insults at them and make them do exercise. When you interrupt people's sleep, they tend to become a little disoriented. And since there was no daylight in the prison, they had no idea whether it was night or day. I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment. Zimbardo responded not as a psychologist, but as a prison superintendent.
I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally, and in return, all I would like is some information from time to time about what the prisoners are doing. So essentially I'm saying, I'd like you to be a snitch, an informer. And I said, think it over, and if you still want to leave, fine.
Confused, prisoner 8612 returned to his cell and told the other prisoners that no one could leave.
He believed that we wouldn't let him go, although we've never said that. But the fact that he was the ringleader of the rebellion, and he told the other prisoners, they won't let you leave. And that really transformed the experiment into a prison.
I was told that I couldn't quit. And at that point, I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
Soon after returning to his cell, prisoner 8612 started showing signs of severe distress.
God damn it! Fucked up! You don't know, I mean, God! I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I just fucking can't take it.
He came up with a plan that if he acted crazy, we would have to release him.
I'm so fucked up inside, I feel really fucked up inside, you don't know, I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that, I'm fucked up, I don't know how to explain it, I'm fucked up inside! Out! Out now!
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming and, you know, whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, you know, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said, we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
The boundary between reality and make-believe was to become blurred even for Zimbardo. A rumor circulated that released prisoner 8612 would return with friends to liberate the remaining prisoners.
I quickly convinced myself that, you know, my most important function was, you know, not to allow this prison liberation to occur. And what can I do to keep my prison going, not the experiment going?
The prison was dismantled and the prisoners moved to another part of the building. Zimbardo waited in the empty corridor, preparing to tell 8612 and his friends that the study was over, when a colleague appeared and began asking questions about the scientific basis of the research.
I'm trying to get rid of him. And then he says, what's the independent variable? I get furious because he doesn't understand that there's a riot about to take place, that this prison is about to erupt. I had totally lost this whole other identity of scientist, researcher, psychologist.
The rumored jailbreak never materialized. The guards had dismantled the prison for nothing and had to rebuild it. They took their frustration out on the prisoners.
They escalated again the level of control, the level of dominance, the level of humiliating behavior.
"819 was the next prisoner to rebel against the harassment of the guards. He barricaded himself in his cell and refused to take part in the count.
You're not only not getting a cigarette, but for as long as the cell's blockaded, you're going to be in solitary when you get out. I go, what?
For 819's disobedience, the guards made his cellmates do mindless work. This undermined any vestige of solidarity amongst the prisoners, who now chose to accept the tyranny of the guards rather than risk further harassment.
That was one of the surprising things to me, is that there was so little that the prisoners did to support one another after we started our campaign of, you know, divide and conquer.
Isolated and distraught, prisoner 819 told Zimbardo he wanted to leave.
While I'm interviewing 819 and saying, okay, you know, it's all over, thank you for your participation, you know, I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early, he hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a Prisoner 819.
And he said, I can't leave. And he's crying. And he says, I can't leave. I said, what do you mean you can't leave? He said, no, I have to go back because I don't want them to think that I'm a bad prisoner. And that's when I really flipped out. And in such a short time, a college student's thinking could become so distorted. I said, you're not a bad prisoner. You're not a prisoner. And this is not a prison. And it was this thing where he opened his eye, and it was just really like a cloud being lifted.
Seeing things clearly, prisoner 819 reverted to his original request and was released.
416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
The study showed that power corrupts and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of abuse to stand up and defend themselves. Why doesn't anybody who is being abused by a spouse or something like that just say, stop it? And we realize now that that's not as easy as it sounds.
By the end of the 5th day, 4 prisoners had broken down and been released. 416 was on the 2nd day of his hunger strike, and the experiment still had another 9 days to run. At this point, a fellow psychologist visited Zimbardo's basement prison and would witness the brutality of the experiment firsthand.
The guards had lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet, had bags over their head, chains on their feet, and were marching by. And I looked up and I saw this circus, this parade. And I said, hey, Chris, look at that.
I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just, I just turned away. And I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, we had a big argument. You're supposed to be a psychologist. This is this interesting dynamic behavior in such a few days. But I'm going through this whole thing, the power of the situation. She says, no, it's that young boys are suffering and you are responsible. You're letting it happen. I said, oh my God, of course you're right.
The next day, Zimbardo ended the experiment. Studies like his stimulated heated debate about the ethics of using human subjects.
Clearly, young men suffered, verbally, physically. Prisoners felt shame in their role. Guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
In the wake of experiments like Zimbardo's and Milgram's, ethical guidelines changed, introducing greater safeguards to protect participants.
So that's another great example of, how much can we ask participants to do before it becomes unethical? And again, the biggest thing that we want to know was the benefits of the research, what they learned about maybe human behavior or people's response to different roles. Was that worth it in light of any damage that could have done to people? So in this case, once these studies kind of came out, and especially in reaction to the Tuskegee and Willowbrook studies, in 1974, the U.S. enacted this National Research Act. And this was sort of a follow-up to the Nuremberg Code, because it was becoming clear that people, scientists, psychologists, biomedicine doctors weren't necessarily following the code to the letter. So they wanted to create an actual U.S. act or law that made sure that this was happening. And as part of this, they instituted these institutional review boards, and these are boards that answer directly to the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and their job is basically to review and approve any research that happens to human subjects. And we'll talk about exactly how they do that here in a bit. But I just want to let you know, that there is research that is exempt from IRB approval, basically those that are done for educational purposes only. So, if we collect data in a class that we're only using in class, and we're never going to publish it or put it on, a poster at a conference, that doesn't need IRB approval, at least if there's no harm or deception done. Now, if there's harm or deception done, that might require IRB approval. Also, anything that comes from public record is not needed for IRB approval in order to analyze that data. So anything from a big sample like the U.S. Census Bureau all the way to stuff you might find on Facebook. Also, recording of public behavior usually isn't require IRB approval. But anything where you're having people come into the lab, have their behavior recorded or manipulated in some way, and something that you're going to publish in an academic paper or otherwise publish in some other medium, that usually requires some type of review by an ethics board. So the ethics boards go by three main principles when approving or disapproving of research. The biggest one, and sort of a catch-all for a lot of other ethical codes, is does the benefits of the research outweigh any foreseeable risk? So this is to say that in some cases you can knowingly put participants in some amount of risk. Never a lot, but you could maybe make a participant a little bit uncomfortable by asking them sensitive questions. Or in some cases you can even cause participants pain in a safe way. So a really popular way of causing physical pain without doing any actual harm is to use maybe small amounts of electricity to submerge people's hands into a bowl of ice water. Of course, not so long they'll get hypothermia, but long enough that they'll have some pain. So in this case, you're always asking, so if there is any pain or even psychological damage or anything, risk of psychological damage, is this risk outweighed by the potential benefits of research? And of course, this is a very subjective estimate, but ethics boards have a lot of specific rules to sort of guide them in that process. Beyond that, and these ones are a little more cut and dry, participation in experiment always has to be very clearly voluntary. So in this case, the experimenter is always expected to get written informed consent from participants, basically a signed letter saying that the participant has been informed of the experiment, they know exactly what's going to happen to them, or at least in terms of anything that might be risky, and that the participant knows they can leave at any time. And then after the experiment is done, participants must be debriefed. If there's any deception in the experiment, it has to be cleared up. They have to know the aim of the study, who to contact if they need any psychological or physical services afterward, or if they'd like to make any complaints. So basically, the participant really needs to be informed throughout the entire part of the experiment. At this point, most research is reviewed by the IRB, Institutional Review Boards, and these boards are, of course, basically tasked with making sure that all participants know exactly what they're being asked to do, and that they know they can leave at any time. And they keep the participants' mental and physical health in their best interests, basically protecting that throughout any experiment, and that people are fully debriefed, just like we were talking about. And so again, the big guiding principle is any harm done to participants, and hopefully it's very little. Is it, one, avoidable? And if unavoidable, is it outweighed by the benefits of the research? And at this point in time, IRBs are very conservative, so if there's any harm at all, that research has to be really valuable. They have to have some way in which the results of that research might benefit people in a substantial way in the near future. So for the most part, IRBs oversee biomedical research, meaning research on medicines, physical therapy, things like that. And because of this, of course, any psychological experiment also gets reviewed, but because of this, most of the reviewers have no background in the social sciences. So this puts a lot of IRBs at sort of a disadvantage for reviewing psychological, sociological, or anthropological research, is that very often everyone on the board of these IRBs are people like doctors, ethical practitioners who have an emphasis in biomedicine, but people who really don't know much about the fields of the social sciences. So this has caused a lot of problems for psychologists, along with sociologists and anthropologists, because they like to do research on people, but then when they submit their research to IRBs, oftentimes they have to explain things that really any psychologist would know automatically. They have to go into, well, I've done many of these, often a ridiculous amount of detail into things that would really cause no harm at all to participants. And a lot of psychologists feel that they're doing work that is not harmful and involves no deception. So why do they even need IRB approval, especially the very long-term or time-consuming types of IRB approval that most biomedical research requires? So let's say that you are a researcher that really just does survey studies. So you're doing things like getting demographic information, maybe having people take a scale on stress or alcohol use or whatever. So in this way, they're just reporting behaviors that they do, and there's no manipulation, there's no deception. Still, that researcher has to go to an IRB, submit a full application. Usually it takes a few months to attain IRB approval. And so during this time, a researcher is just sort of sitting on their hands, sitting on this project, which they could have done, possibly in a week and gathered data and published it and gone on to the next study. So in a lot of ways, this delays research, it delays careers in psychology. It makes it hard for some psychologists to get done with their dissertation in a timely manner. Let's say if they're in a graduate program and they have only about a year to do their dissertation or 2 years, if they're waiting for 4 to 6 months for each individual study to get approved, they might not be able to graduate on time. So it's one of those things that's a real hardship for psychologists in terms of time, resources, and for the most part, it's unnecessary because most psychological research doesn't involve any harm at all to participants, not like biomedical research, which of course, involves physical manipulations of participants. So in this case, IRB has become a little more lenient over time on psychologists. They've applied basically different rules to some psychological research versus biomedical research. And now a lot of psychological research can apply for what's called exempt or expedited review process. So in this case, it gets sent to, instead of a board, just one member of the IRB. So a board typically contains anywhere from 5 to 10 members, which each have to review the research project, either approve it or disapprove of it. And then if there is not a unanimous approval, they have to, of course, meet as a group and do a more extensive review and then offer corrections. And that's what takes so long about this process. So instead, going the expedited or exempt route can quicken it very substantially. Sometimes it can make it a matter of weeks as opposed to months of review, because in this case, they only have one person review it. And if this person says, well, there's clearly no risk to participants in this survey study or whatever it is, then that's it. It's been approved. And there has been a push to even quicken and better this process for psychologists by actually having IRBs that are specifically tailored to these subfields. So maybe have an IRB just for psychology and an IRB just for biomedicine, or maybe an IRB for all the social sciences lumped together and all the biomedicine sciences lumped together. But at this point, there's just not enough funding to do that sort of thing. But that would probably be a better way of handling it, just so, even if there is harm for psychology studies, it should be other psychologists and sociologists and whatnot that are able to review that, because they would know a lot more about any psychological damage, for instance, of a psychology study than someone with a pure biomedicine background. So one of the last things to consider here is we've covered the ethical treatment of humans. And of course, now that we have IRBs, that really takes care of the fact that humans, all research on them is very voluntary. They're informed. They have the right to leave at any time. They have the right to receiving help if they need to, any psychological or physical help if they need to afterward. They have people they can complain to. So humans have a lot of rights in research in this day and age. But some people argue that animals really don't. So this is not completely true. There are actually ethics boards for animals in research. So the biggest one is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and this is basically the IRB of animal research. And so they oversee the collection, the treatment, and the housing of animals in research. And their ethical practices are to use animals only as a last resort, so whenever possible to use non-living creatures, and to use lower form animals like insects and rats before any higher form animals, again, if it's at all possible, and to use as few animals as possible. And when animals are, when it can be made the case, they should be kept safe, free from harm, and even mentally active. And that last one was added pretty recently in the 2000s. They were doing studies on rats, and they found that rats who were not given any type of, toys or social contact often exhibited signs of stress and ill health. And so now this IACOC boards are requiring a lot of researchers to, basically make the rat environments better. As, of course, also with any research on dogs, cats, chimps, monkeys, all that sort of thing, they want to make sure that the animal is as comfortable physically and mentally as possible. So because of this, animals are actually used very sparingly in research. Science sometimes gets a bad rap because we see on TV these clinics where there's just rack after rack after rack of chimps housed in these little cages and maltreated. And that simply doesn't happen in this day and age. Probably hasn't happened for many decades. I, for one, have been in research labs that have monkeys. I've never been in one that has chimps, but I've been in ones with tamarin monkeys, macaque monkeys, other ones with cats and dogs. And in these cases, oftentimes they're kept in groups, if it's at all possible. They're usually kept in pretty large enclosures with toys to sort of keep them active, and they're given daily contact. So really, it's not nearly as bad as it's made out to be in TV and movies oftentimes. And also, again, they're used very sparingly. So these labs are actually very few and far between and only used with research that absolutely requires them. So in this case, when you're talking about higher order animals like dogs and cats and primates, these are very rare. They account for less than 1% of the animals used for research. 95% of the animals research are rats, basically, or lab mice. Well, technically they're lab rats, but we won't get into that distinction. So a lot of these other research, the remaining 4.5% or so, are mostly insects. So in this case, there is very few animal labs that even employ anything that you'd recognize as a potential pet or as an intelligent animal. And just as a perspective, I thought this was a good statistic, and this is all from speakingofresearch.com, which is a watch group for animal rights in studies and research, that for every one animal that is euthanized in the purposes of research, there are 350 killed for food. So it's sort of one of those things that if you're someone who is for animal rights, probably this would be a better cause is to go try to convert more people to be vegetarians, or try to take cars off the road, because for every animal killed in research, about 14 are run over by cars. And of course, in this case, for every one animal killed in research, which 95% of them are going to be rats, and another 4% or so are going to be insects, for the 350 that are killed for food, most of those are cows, pigs, chickens, basically higher order life forms. And, the 14 run over by cars are obviously mostly going to be non-mice, non-insect as well. So if you count just higher order life forms, for every one dog killed in research, I'm sure there are thousands of dogs killed by cars. So one question that might come up, though, is why study animals at all? Well, animals can offer a wealth of information, even when talking about higher order psychological phenomenon. And that's because, and this is a great thing, a great saying I like, is that we are not like animals, we are animals. Most of the systems that make us up, including our brains, and our spinal cords and internal organs and external organs, are extremely similar across species. For the most part, we don't qualitatively differ from animals in almost any organ group. We usually differ a bit in function and maybe quantity of different organ clusters, but for the most part, when you look at our livers or our individual neurons, they operate the exact same as they would even in mice. And in fact, we share about 95% of our genes with mice, so we're even genetically very similar to most of these animals. And one thing about humans is not only can we not, ethically put a lot of do a lot of these experiments that we do with animals on humans, but also some of the experiments wouldn't even make sense with humans. So for example, if we wanted to study how neurons work, it wouldn't make sense to use a human who has really, really complex networks of neurons where any given neuron can have literally thousands of different connections, making for totals of hundreds of trillions of connections in the brain. Instead, what researchers have done is isolated animals that have very simple neural structures in order to really see how neurons work. So for one example, mealworms make up a great sample for studying neurons because they have only a cluster of neurons, only a few. They're very large neurons. They actually run up and down the entire body of the mealworm. And they operate and look just like human neurons. So very often what we can do is find something that's complex in humans and then find a species in which it's not nearly so complex so that we can really study it in more detail without getting, basically losing the forest for the trees. And of course, the biggest reason to use animals for a lot of this research is that there is sometimes research you want to do that's unethical. So for example, if you really want to know what a brain region does, one of the best ways to figure that out is to lesion it or make it inactive. So that's one way in which we discovered that the hypothalamus, for instance, works to create new memories. We discovered that first in humans who just naturally had their hypothalamus lesioned through disease or injury, but that's not really a good way to test that out as a theory because there could be lots of other confounds going on. So what they did was they took mice and lesioned the hypothalamus of the mice and then had them try to learn mazes compared to a control group with intact hippocampi, and found that those with unintact or lesioned hippocampi couldn't ever learn a new maze after they received that surgery. So that was sort of validation or replication of that effect in an animal model. And oftentimes when we're trying to figure out, especially in the beginning stages, the impact of medications, different types of therapy programs, or the effect of harmful things like food, exercise, or sunlight deprivation, or any type of deprivation or pain, we're going to want to use an animal model as opposed to humans. And actually, we're going to sort of end with this video. It's a great example of using mice to study something called Rett syndrome. And it just shows you how far we've come with animal models. Now we can actually directly manipulate the genes of animals and actually give them symptoms of human-like disorders. And this is a video on Rett syndrome, but we've actually been able to do something with a more recognizable syndrome, autism and ADHD. So through some genetic manipulation, we've actually been able to create Rats with autism, those who are very socially isolated, who tend to be easily overstimulated. They'll often even do things like fiddle with their hands, rock back and forth, become fixated on small objects just like people with autism. And also rats with ADHD, ones that are very hyperactive, who can't concentrate, who have a hard time learning new tasks, who have low inhibition control. So in this case, we can actually create very human-like disorders in rats, and then, of course, figure out ways of treating those disorders. So I think this is a great example with Rett syndrome.
How does that work?
So Rett syndrome is actually quite fascinating. It's named after an Austrian pediatrician, Andreas Rett, and he discovered it because he saw these patients in his clinic, and then now we've seen many of these patients around the world. And what happens, these girls are born normal. They can learn how to do everything a 1-year-old will typically do. Some of them will actually learn how to speak few words. Some will even learn how to say nursery rhymes. They'll be able to use their hands, feed themselves, play with toys, socially interactive. And then something happens, and it happens during that critical period that we've talked about. Somehow this part of the regular postnatal developmental program gets interrupted, and these girls all of a sudden will stop using their hands, instead will just constantly wring their hands. They'll lose the social interaction, they'll lose the coordination, they will lose any language, they will lose the balance, and they'll have motor difficulty, and with time will develop spasticity, they'll have seizures, anxiety, and a variety of other medical and neurological problems. It really affects all parts of the brain. So it's quite an unusual disorder, but what it taught us that this critical postnatal developmental period is really important. And if we look at the video, we're going to show a video clip of a girl who started life as normal. You see her picking a toy, and she's picking the toy with her hands. She can run around. She's functioning just as a perfect 1-year-old would normally function. Here she is at a couple years of age going through the book. She's using her hands well. She can use the book, and she's still doing quite well. And then we're going to see her when she developed Rett syndrome. Now you'll notice she's not quite steady on her feet. And you'll see that she can't use her hands. She looks at the book, she touches it, but she can't really anymore use her hands. And instead, what she'll do with her hands is she'll hold them together and she'll constantly wring them. Doesn't have as much of social interaction. She'll have seizures and a variety of neurological problems. This happens time and time again to all these girls. And the question, what happens? And the way we were able to really start to learn a little bit what goes on in the child's brain when they have Rett syndrome is first by finding the gene. And then when you find the gene, you can genetically engineer animal models to study what happens. You can replicate the mutation that's in the human, engineer it in the mouse, and see what will the mouse reproduce the features of Rett syndrome. Having a mouse model, you can look what's happening in the brain before the symptoms develop, during, and through the course. And what was really surprising, would you think that a mouse would wring its hands if you gave it Rett syndrome mutation? And that's the case. So we're going to look at a video clip of a normal mouse, and you're going to see how a normal mouse will keep its paws apart. And then, so this is a healthy normal mouse keeping its paws apart. And then if you hold the Rett syndrome mouse model,
it's amazing. Oh, look at that.
You will see how it will be wringing its paws together.
Wow.
And this mouse will have all the features that we see. It has learning problems, it has balance problems, it'll have seizures, all the features we see in the human patients we will see in the models. So models are really very, very important. And it turns out that the protein that's lost in Rett syndrome, we call it MACP2 for short, is really critical for those synapses we talked about. So if we look at a healthy brain, after all the sculpting and the pruning happens, you have to have just the right number of synapses between two communicated neurons. And this is what we would expect in a healthy brain. In the case of the Rett syndrome, what happens when the protein is lost, we have fewer synapses.
So without animal research, there's so much that we would be in the dark about. For example, almost any type of drug that we have now, including lots of psychotropic drugs, those to treat mental disorders, come at first, phase 1 trials with animals, mostly with rats, and then maybe with other higher form animals if that's needed. any research on development. So, for example, the fact that we now know that early deprivation, and this could be visual deprivation, could be social deprivation, can cause serious disorders later down the line when children reach adulthood. We first figured this out primarily with research on cats and their visual processes. Because of animal research, we now know how most of our sensory systems work, even to the point now where we can actually directly interact with them. So, of course, now they have prosthetic arms that can receive information from your motor cortex. They have, for blind individuals, cameras that can send signals back to the occipital lobe. So we're actually making great strides in this research. And for example, the research where they're sending images to directly stimulate the occipital lobe, basically allowing a blind person to suddenly see again, that was research that was done, a lot of it at UC Davis, so a local college, with cats. So that's one of those things where that's a very direct link between helping blind people see and animal research that was required to do that. But just so much, how the nervous system functions, how behavior can change with brain changes, how brain changes during learning, after trauma, and it's just so much more. The list is really endless. So in this way, there are just a multitude of things that we only know because of animal research. That sort of summarizes this bit of ethics. So we covered quite a bit, of course, the ethical treatment of humans, the ethical treatment of animals, and also the impetus for those, the notorious studies like the Tuskegee studies, the World War II studies, all the way through to the Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo studies of the 70s and 60s. So that's it for this lecture.